Nonviolent protests can be effective. In fact, there's a broad consensus among historians that civil rights was effective because of its large, disruptive, nonviolent protests and marches, and not necessarily because of the threat of violence. And this is for a number of reasons, right? First of all, better media coverage, both in quantity and quality, which makes sense considering that our media in this country and in lots of the countries throughout the world are owned by multi-billion-dollar international media conglomerates that control everything we see because they can control public opinion that way. And it also makes sense because of the way conservatives have painted, like, for example, Black Lives Matter protests and or civil rights protests at the time as violent, as look at what these people are doing, they're destroying our cities, even though the vast majority of them were not violent in both cases. But this is why conservatives, when they get a drop of violence in these protests, they make you think it's an ocean because they don't want to change anything, and these protesters are ultimately advocating for some kind of big change. And number two, nonviolent protests get more support from the public. When they are violent, people tend to shy away from that. And number three, and I think most importantly, nonviolent protests don't give the state a reason to use violence. If the protests start with violence, then the state responding with violence is just defense. It's like, oh, well, we were just protecting our cities from these dangerous savages. This is why the FBI has a history of hiring people to go into nonviolent protests and turn them violent. And so I think all of this makes sense. The problem is, largely since 2017, which incidentally is also the first full year of Donald Trump's first term, Republicans have passed legislation to take rights and protections away from protesters. When you take away protections from protesters, you make it not safe to non-violently demonstrate anymore. Because if the state can use violence to squash a non-violent protest, well, then in the same way that I said before, where the state just wants to use violence, the protesters have to start using violence as a way of self-defense. And this is why the First Amendment is so important, because it protects not only the safety but also the effectiveness of non-violent protests so that violence is not necessary. And so when you have actual fascism running this country, when you have actual Nazis in positions of the highest power of this country, not protesting is not a choice. Because there are those of us who will not be on the wrong side of history when we get past this, right? So your choice is nonviolent protest or violent protest. And if it's nonviolent, then you need to fight for protections for protesters, so that they can safe and effectively protest.